She took the photo of my husband off the mantel and put it in a cardboard box without asking me. That was the moment. Not the first time she spoke to me like I was furniture. Not the months of rearranging my kitchen so I couldn't find my own pots. Not even the Christmas she told my son, right in front of me, that maybe I should think about assisted living. It was the photo, my husband of 41 years, gone 3 winters now, in his fishing hat, standing at the edge of Lake Travis the summer before the diagnosis. That photo had lived on that mantel since the day we moved into this house in 1987, and she put it in a box. I stood at the doorway of my own living room and watched her do it. She didn't look up. My name is not important right now. What is important is that I am 67 years old. I taught middle school science for 32 years in Austin, Texas. I raised one son mostly on my own after my husband's health began to fail, and I own my home outright. No mortgage, no liens. Paid off in 2019, with the last of what my husband and I saved together. My name alone is on that deed. I want you to remember that part. My son's name is Miles. He was a good boy. I say that the way mothers do when they're trying to hold on to something, because somewhere between the boy I raised and the man who stood in my hallway last April and said, "Mom, you're overreacting," I lost track of which one I was talking to. His wife's name is Daphne. I will try to be fair to her. I will try. Daphne is 34. She works in marketing. She has opinions about everything. The way a house should look, the way meals should be timed, the way older women should behave when they are lucky enough to be included. She is not a cruel person in the way that people in movies are cruel. She is the kind of cruel that happens quietly, in the language of suggestions and sighs and rearranged furniture, until one day you realize you've been managed out of your own life. Miles and Daphne had been living in a rented apartment in Round Rock when their landlord decided to sell the building. They needed a place. I had space. The house has 3 bedrooms and I was alone in it, and my son was my son. And so I said yes. Come stay here while you figure things out. Take the back bedroom. Stay as long as you need. That was 22 months ago. I want to be precise about that number. 22 months. In that time they paid me nothing toward utilities, nothing toward groceries, most weeks, nothing toward the property taxes that came due in January, which I paid out of my teacher's pension. I am not a woman who leads with money. My mother raised me to believe that family doesn't keep score. But I am also a woman who spent 32 years teaching children to distinguish between a hypothesis and a fact. And the fact was this: I was carrying this house alone, the same as I had always carried it, except now there were 2 more people in it, and one of them had started looking at my living room like it was a problem she was solving. The changes came slowly, the way changes do when someone is paying close attention to how much you'll accept. First it was the curtains. Mine were cream-coloured, heavy, the kind that kept the Texas afternoon heat out. Daphne said they made the room feel closed off. New ones arrived, thin linen things in a shade she called warm sand. The afternoon sun came straight through them. I started sitting in the kitchen instead, then the couch. Mine was a deep burgundy sectional, bought the year Miles started high school. Daphne said it overwhelmed the space. A new one appeared, grey, low to the ground, the kind that looks like it belongs in a catalogue but is difficult to get out of when your knees are what mine are. I didn't argue. I told myself it was just furniture. Then my reading chair. The one by the window with the armrest worn smooth on the right side where my hand always rested. She moved it to the corner. Said it interrupted the flow. I moved it back. She moved it again. I moved it back again. After the 3rd time, she stopped moving it and started ignoring it instead. The way you ignore something you've decided doesn't fit. I noticed all of it, but I am not a woman who makes a scene. I was raised in a different time, with a different vocabulary for these things. I kept quiet, and I kept moving through my own house like a guest who didn't want to be a bother. And Miles. I have to be honest about Miles. Miles saw it and said nothing. He would catch my eye sometimes, in the kitchen, when she'd said something that landed the wrong way, and there'd be a flicker of something. Recognition, maybe. Apology. But then he'd look back at his phone and the moment would pass and I would be left holding it alone. The photo was on a Tuesday. I had been at my friend Odessa's house that afternoon. Odessa and I have been friends since our children were in diapers. She's the kind of person who tells you the truth in a tone that makes it feel like kindness. I had lunch there, we watched our show. I drove home around 4:30, parked in my own driveway, walked through my own front door. Daphne was in the living room. She had brought several cardboard boxes from somewhere, and she was moving things. My things. The small ceramic bowl my mother brought back from New Mexico. The framed needlepoint that my husband's mother made the year Miles was born. And the photo. His photo. She had it in her hands. I said, "What are you doing?" She turned around, not startled, not ashamed. Calm. "I'm just doing a little refresh," she said. "The room feels cluttered. I thought we could store some of this stuff." "That's my husband's photo," I said. "I know," she said. "I thought maybe the bedroom would be a better place for it." She said it gently. That was the thing. She said it gently, like she was doing me a favor. Like she was curating my grief into a more appropriate room. I stood there for a moment. Something happened in my chest that I can only describe as a door closing very quietly from the inside. I said, "Put it back." She looked at me for a beat too long. Then she set it down, not back on the mantel, but on the side table, propped against the wall, angled slightly wrong. Close enough to say she'd listened, far enough to say she hadn't. I didn't move it right then. I went to my room and I sat on the edge of my bed and I looked at the wall and I thought about my husband and I thought about what he would have said and I thought about the fact that his name was also on the original mortgage that I had worked for 30 years to pay off. And I thought about how strange it was that I was sitting in the bedroom of my own house trying to figure out how to exist in it. That night I called my sister, Laverne. She lives in Houston. She has less patience than I do for what she called, very plainly, this nonsense. She said, "Barbara, that's my name." She said, "Barbara, that's my name." She said, "Barbara, you have got to stop being polite." I told her I wasn't sure what the alternative was. She said, "Honey, you own the building. Act like it." I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, Miles left early for work. Daphne worked from home, which meant she was in the house all day, which meant I was in my own house from 9 in the morning, trying to be small enough not to start anything. I made coffee. I took it to my reading chair by the window. I had moved it back again. I sat down with my cup and the morning paper, the actual paper, which I still have delivered, because I am 67 years old and I have earned my habits. Daphne came downstairs around 9:30, saw me, and I watched something cross her face. Not anger exactly, more like inconvenience. She went to the kitchen, came back with her own coffee, and sat on the grey couch with her laptop. We were in the same room, not speaking, and the silence had a texture to it that I had learned to recognize over 22 months. It was the texture of someone deciding whether to say something. She decided. "I have a call in a few minutes," she said, not looking up. "A client call. I usually take them in here because the lighting is better." I looked at her over my paper. "I'm not in your way," I said. "It's just," she said, "it's a video call. And it's a little distracting having someone in the background." I looked around. My reading chair is against the side wall. I am not behind her. I am not in anyone's background. "I'll be quiet," I said. "It's not about the noise," she said, and her voice had that particular tone, patient and thin at the same time, like she was explaining something to a child who was being slow. "It's just, it would be easier if the room was clear. It looks more professional. I set my cup down on the coaster that I have used for 25 years, on the side table that I bought at an estate sale in 1996. I folded my newspaper. I looked at my daughter-in-law, who was sitting on a couch in my living room asking me to leave it. "This is my house," I said. She smiled. It was a specific kind of smile. Tolerant. Practiced. "I know," she said. "I'm just asking for an hour." I got up. I took my coffee and my newspaper and I went to the kitchen, and I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at the window over the sink, and I thought about how long I had been going to the kitchen. That afternoon I drove to see my friend Odessa again. I wasn't planning to. I just found myself in the car, then in her driveway, then at her kitchen table with a glass of iced tea, saying things out loud that I had not said out loud before. Odessa listened. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Do you know what the legal situation is? With the house?" I told her what I knew. The house is mine. Has always been mine. They are not on the deed. They have no lease agreement, nothing in writing, because it never occurred to me to write anything down. They were my family. Odessa looked at me over her tea and said, "You should talk to someone, a real someone." I went home that night and I looked up Texas property law on my laptop for 2 hours. I'm a science teacher. I know how to research. I found the terms licensee, not tenant. No written agreement, owner occupied. I found the words for what I could do, and I found the name of a real estate attorney on 6th Street with good reviews and a consultation fee of $150. I made the appointment for the following Thursday, and I told no one. The days between that appointment and the conversation at Odessa's had a different quality. I moved through them the same as always, making my coffee, sitting in my chair, watching the morning news at the volume I preferred. But something had shifted in me, a kind of quiet that wasn't resignation anymore, more like decision. The attorney's name was Mr. Calloway. He was about 40, wore glasses, had the kind of steady manner that I imagine is useful when people come to him with the particular kind of tired I had. I had across from him and I told him the situation. He asked questions. I answered them. He took notes. At the end, he said, "You're in a strong position. They are guests, legally speaking. You can ask them to leave." Texas doesn't require much in the way of notice for a family licensee. Typically 30 days is reasonable and defensible. If you want, we can formalize it. I asked what formalize it meant. He said it meant a written notice, hand-delivered, with a date. Official and clear. I said, "I'd like to do that." I drove home from downtown Austin, and I sat in my driveway for a few minutes before going inside. The oak tree in the front yard, the one my husband planted when Miles was 2, had started budding. The light was coming through it in a way that it only does in March in Texas, when everything is still deciding whether to be green. I went inside. I didn't say anything that night. I made dinner. Chicken and rice, the way I've always made it, with the spices my mother used, and I set the table and the 3 of us sat down, and it was almost ordinary. Daphne talked about her work. Miles talked about a project at the firm. I listened. I passed the salt. I watched my son's hands, which look exactly like his father's, and I thought, I am not angry. I want you to know that. I was never angry. I was just done. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning, Mr. Calloway's assistant hand-delivered an envelope to my front door. I was home. Daphne was home. Miles had already left for work. The doorbell rang and I went to the door. A woman in a blazer held out an envelope. "For the occupants at this address," she said, and then she handed me a second one. "And this one is your copy, ma'am." I thanked her. I closed the door. I stood in my own foyer with the 2 envelopes, and I felt, very distinctly, that this was one of those moments you remember in a particular way, not dramatic, not triumphant, just clear. I set my copy on the kitchen counter, and I left the other envelope on the entryway table, propped against the bowl my mother brought from New Mexico, which I had moved back to the entryway where it had always been. Then I went to the living room, sat in my reading chair, and opened a newspaper. About 20 minutes later, I heard Daphne come downstairs. I heard her footsteps in the entryway. I heard her pick up the envelope. I heard a long pause. Then, what is this? I turned a page of the newspaper. It came this morning, I said. She appeared in the doorway of the living room, the envelope open in her hand, her face arranged in an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Not the patient thin smile, not the managed inconvenience. This was something unguarded. She started. The letter explains everything, I said. You got a lawyer? I did. She stood there a moment. Then she said, Does Miles know about this? He will when he reads his copy, I said. There's one in the envelope. She left the room. I heard her on the phone, her voice low and quick, in the bedroom upstairs. I kept reading my paper. Outside the window, the oak tree was fully budded now, that new green that only lasts a week before it deepens into summer. Miles called me from work at 11:15. I answered. Mom, he said, and his voice had the particular quality of a man who doesn't know which feeling to lead with. What is this? You need to find another place to live, I said. I've given you 30 days, which is more than fair. I've been patient for 22 months. I need my home back. Silence. Then, Mom, we can talk about this. You didn't have to involve a lawyer. I tried talking, I said. I tried for a long time. He was quiet again. I could hear the office around him, the distant sound of other people's ordinary days. Is this about Daphne? He said. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the curtains and the couch and the reading chair and the kitchen and the photo of his father. I thought about 22 months of going to the kitchen. I thought about the way she'd held his photo in her hands and put it in a box like it was clutter. This is about me, I said. This is about my house, which I have paid for and earned and lived in for 37 years. That's what this is about. He said he needed time to think. I told him he had 30 days, which was time enough. He hung up. I sat for a moment with the phone in my lap. Then I got up and went to the mantel, and I moved my husband's photo back to its place. Centered at eye level, in the fishing hat, Lake Travis behind him, the summer before the diagnosis. Right where it had lived for 3 winters. The weeks that followed were not comfortable. I want to be honest about that. Miles was quiet in a way that was worse than arguments. Daphne moved through the house with a stiffness that filled the rooms. There were no more suggestions about curtains. There were no more client calls in the living room. There were a lot of closed doors and muffled conversations. But I drank my coffee in my reading chair. I watched the news at my volume. I cooked in my kitchen without checking whether I was in someone's way. It is remarkable, actually, what it feels like to simply exist in your own space without bracing. I had forgotten what that felt like. I hadn't realized I'd been bracing. 3 weeks after the letter, Miles came to the kitchen on a Sunday morning while I was making eggs. Just him. Daphne was still upstairs. He poured himself coffee and he sat at the table, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, I'm sorry, Mom. I kept making my eggs. I kept telling myself it wasn't that bad, he said. That you were, I don't know, adjusting, or that you'd say something if it got to be too much. I did say something, I said, many times. I know. He was quiet again. I wasn't listening the right way. I put the eggs on the plate, and I brought them to the table, and I sat across from my son, and I looked at his hands, his father's hands, and I thought about what it means to love someone and still require something of them. These things are not opposites. A mother who has spent 32 years teaching children understands something about the difference between being kind and being a pushover, and about how sometimes the kindest thing you can do is to draw the line clearly so that everyone knows where they stand. "I love you," I said. "I want you to be okay. I want you and your wife to build a real life that belongs to you both. You can't do that here. Not like this." He nodded. He looked like the boy I raised, the one I had been trying to hold on to. They found an apartment in Pflugerville. Miles and I loaded the truck together on a Saturday in early May. Daphne was cordial, careful. "We have not yet found our way back to easy, she and I, but the door is not closed. I leave it open because my son loves her and because I am not in the business of permanent damage. I only required what was mine." The afternoon they left, I walked through the house room by room. Not to inspect, not to inventory, just to feel it. My curtains were back on the windows, the heavy cream ones I'd pulled from the closet. The burgundy sectional was back in storage. I'd had a young man from church help me bring it in. My reading chair was by the window where it belonged, the armrest worn smooth on the right side. I went to the mantel. His photo was exactly where I'd put it. I made a cup of coffee and I sat in my chair and I looked out the window at the oak tree, now in full summer green, heavy and still, the way the Texas oaks get in May when the heat has settled in for its long stay. The house was quiet, not the held breath quiet of those months, not the silence that has tension in it and edges. This was the other kind. The kind that means nothing is being managed, nothing is being measured, nothing has to brace itself. It was just my house. I was just home. There is something I want to say to anyone listening who recognizes what I've described. Not the details, maybe, but the shape of it. The slow accumulation of small things until you can't remember the last time you moved through a room without calculating. The way love for your children can make you wait longer than you should have. The way someone can make you feel like a guest in the house you've paid for without ever raising their voice. You are not obligated to wait until it breaks you. You can choose a different moment. You can choose this one. The law was there the whole time. The deed was in my name the whole time. I just needed someone, Odessa, Laverne, Mr. Calloway, and eventually myself, to remind me that owning something means you are allowed to act like it. I drank my coffee at my own window, in my own chair, with the news on at exactly the volume I chose, and I thought, this is what peace actually feels like. Not the absence of noise, not the absence of family, just the presence of yourself in the place you built on your own terms. I have not forgotten how long I waited to get back here. I don't intend to forget. I keep coming back to the photo, not the lawyer, not the letter, not the woman in the blazer at my front door. The photo of my husband in his fishing hat, standing at the edge of Lake Travis the summer before everything changed. That was the moment I understood what was actually happening, not when she rearranged my furniture, not when she asked me to leave my own living room for a client call, but when she held his face in her hands and put it in a box without asking. Something in me went quiet and clear at the same time, and I think that clarity was the result of something I had been building for a long time without knowing it. Here is what I believe. Looking back, what happened to me was not random. It followed a logic. I had spent 22 months being accommodating in ways that I told myself were generous, but were actually, if I am honest, a failure of self-respect. Not because kindness is wrong, but because there is a difference between giving freely and giving without any boundary at all. I taught that distinction to 12-year-olds in a science classroom for 3 decades. I just forgot to apply it at home. And when you stop requiring people to treat you with basic dignity, some of them, not all, but some, will stop offering it. That is not a judgment. That is simply cause and effect. What finally moved me was not anger. I want to be clear about that. It was something quieter, a decision rooted in knowing what was true. The deed was in my name. The house was mine. Those were facts, the way the boiling point of water is a fact, and I am a woman who has always trusted facts. What I had to find was the willingness to act on what I already knew. That took longer than the facts did. It required me to sit across from Mr. Calloway and say out loud, "This is my situation, these are my rights, I would like to use them." There is a particular kind of courage in that sentence. It is not dramatic courage, it is the ordinary, steady kind. The kind that does not announce itself, that just gets in the car and drives downtown and asks the right questions. Miles said he wasn't listening the right way. I have thought about that a lot. I believe him. I also believe that my silence trained him not to listen, that every time I went to the kitchen instead of staying in my chair, I was teaching him that my comfort was negotiable. Parents do that. We absorb difficulty to protect our children from conflict, and sometimes we absorb so much that they never learn to see it. The most honest thing I did in this whole situation was refuse to keep teaching that lesson, not for my sake alone, for his. I am 67 years old. I have earned the right to sit in my own chair, at my own window, with the news on at my own volume, with my husband's face on the mantel where it belongs. Not because I fought for it, because I simply stopped pretending it wasn't mine. Odessa asked me, after everything was settled, whether I had any regrets. I thought about it for a real moment. I said, I regret waiting as long as I did. I don't regret a single thing I did once I decided to act, and I think that is the shape of most things worth doing. The regret is always in the waiting, never in the choosing. You are allowed to know what is yours. You are allowed to protect it. And you do not have to raise your voice to do it.